Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, we race closer and closer to the end of the First Age of Middle-earth. We survive the second and hopefully even third battles of Beleriand. We might even meet an actual dragon, and then we learn a lot of geography. There's a lot of geography to close out what is ostensibly tonight's reading, but here's the good news. We're probably not going to get that far because we have, God, just a mountain to climb. I absolutely have to cover a good chunk of Chapter 13 tonight, but I'm going to be honest, Chapter 14 is probably going to fall off back to next week's scheduled session, but that's okay, because next week is a fairly easy ride, so we'll be able we will cover 3 chapters in 2 weeks, is what I'm saying, and then we'll be exactly back where we are supposed to be. Tonight, my absolute minimum is a mere 18 slides. We've got 18 slides to cover before the timeline of this particular part of the story of the Silmarillion, the story of the First Age of Beleriand in particular tonight, really starts to accelerate. The end of this chapter does a wild trick where suddenly we cover almost 300 years, 300 solar years in just a few pages. So we're going to probably talk about that next week. We will see how it works out because I have a kind of hard out in about 90 minutes. So I don't want to waste too much time right up here at the beginning of the show, which means that I should apologize for starting just a couple of minutes late. I was hoping to pull up the wonderful LOTRproject.com, the interactive map of the Lord of the Rings and all of Tolkien's associated works, but that website is not working for me tonight. And that's okay, because honestly, switching back and forth between LOTR Project to try and illustrate the geography of Beleriand maybe would not have been the best time. But if you are listening to this after the fact, if you are watching the YouTube version of this after the fact, I actively encourage you to go and open the brilliant LOTRproject.com in another tab, in another device, just to have the map right there in front of you, because it is going to help make sense of what is a tangled bit of geography as we move through this week's reading, even more so next week, but this week for sure. So last week, we discussed Arion and Tilion and the creation and then the revision of the new celestial order surrounding Arda. We discussed the creation of the moon, the creation of the sun, their different orbital pathways, and just what the problem with Tilion is, that he is just too enchanted by Arion and the sun above Middle-earth. And then we gestured vaguely toward the emergence of man in Middle-earth in a somewhat incomplete passage that we're definitely going to revisit in the chapters to come. This week, we're rewinding just a few years back before the creation of the sun, back before the creation of the moon, back to the very end of the years of the trees here. Before we begin with that, we're going to take a quick look at the recap of the family trees, because we're going to spend a lot of time here with characters whose names primarily begin with F, some characters whose names begin with C. I'm going to share this slide right here as Glorfin David joins me in the chat. Good to have you with us, Glorfin David, this week. Let's take a look at this slide, this familiar slide from a few weeks ago when we discussed the House of Finwë. This is to remind you, Finwë's first wife, Midiel Sindere, is the mother of Fëanor, about whom much shall be said in the very first part of this week's session, and then not so much later on, because events are going to transpire. I warn you of that right now. And then Finwë's second wife, Indis, after Miriel goes to the halls of Maedhros, so drained is she by the birthing of Fëanor. And, well, I'm going to put a pin in a thought that I have had about Miriel. Maybe we'll run that in some kind of supplemental Q&A. Maybe now is not the time for that thought right now. But I'm curious about the role that Miriel voluntarily plays in the birth of Fëanor, because it occurs to me that we could parse the events of Fëanor's birth in a slightly different way, that we could make Miriel more active in the surrendering of her power, of her Fëa, of the fire that passes into the children of the elves, right? That we could make her more active in that through a careful reading of the text. And I'm not sure that that's a thing that we want to do, but it's a thing that we might endeavor to do in the interests of textual analysis. Maybe that's a project for another time, or even another podcast entirely. Anyway, after Miriel goes off to the halls of Maedhros, her body laying in repose in the gardens of Lorien, we see Finwë marrying Indis, his second wife, and they have children, Fingolfin and Finarfin, right? So Fëanor threatens Fingolfin in the hall in Valinor, in Taniquetil. I forget exactly where that first assault takes place. There are so many place names that I'm trying to remember, and I've basically transposed my entire attention now from Valinor to Beleriand, and some of it has faded in the telling. And of course, we have Finarfin, the younger son, too. So let's move into the sons of this first generation, or the first generation after Finwë, the second generation of the House of Finwë. So now we're going to move into the third generation, their sons. Just to give you a quick recap, the sons of Fëanor are Maedhros, Maglor, Celegorm, Caranthir, Cudafin, Amrod, and Amras. We have Maedhros, the oftentimes referred to as Maedhros the Tall, though he is notably not the tallest even of this generation of elves, of this generation of the Noldor. He is red-haired, famously, and he is staunch friends, fast friends with Fingolfin's son, Fingon, which is going to be very important as we move through tonight's reading. We have Maglor the Singer here. We have Celegorm the Fair and Caranthir, the Dark, who is definitely going to show up at the end of this week's reading, and just be the worst. Just be Caranthir, really in the running for worst person that we're going to talk about in this week's reading. And this is a reading that includes Fëanor, you guys, so you know what I'm saying here. Then we have Cudafin the Crafty, who is going to be the father of Celebrimbor, who's going to be so significant later on. And we have the twins, Amrod and Amras, right here too. The sons of Fingolfin, Fingon the Valiant, the previously mentioned, fast friend of Maedhros. Turgon the Wise, he is noted as being the tallest of all the children of Ilúvatar, period. He is the tallest elf or man to ever live on Arda. Sorry, that's not actually true. He's the tallest of all the children of Ilúvatar, save Thingol. I always forget that Thingol gets that mention there. Thingol is the tallest, but that is presumably because of the influence of Melian, right? He gets supercharged by all that Maya power that Melian gives him. Turgon goes on to found Gondolin, which we might conceivably talk about at the end of this week's session or possibly early in next week's session. Adethel, their sister, doesn't get a lot of screen time, but she will one day be the mother of Maeglin. And if Curufin is the... not Curufin, if Caranthir is the worst in this week's reading, in a couple of weeks we're going to get to Maeglin, who is a strong candidate for just the worst character in any of these books. Just an absolute villain. Fingolfin, according to later writing by the professor, does have another son, a son named Argon, but he isn't mentioned in the Silmarillion and is therefore deemed by this report non-canonical. And then we have the sons of Finarfin Finrod, who will become the ruler of Nargothrond, who will become Finrod Felagund, possibly again at the end of tonight's session, maybe at the beginning of next week's session. A serious contender, let me say this, for coolest guy in the book. Fingon and Finrod both. Two names which I generally confuse with one another, so I'm going to try very carefully not to do that. Fingon and Finrod both are serious contenders for people's favorite elves. I think that they are very popular for reasons which will become apparent as we move through this week's reading. Odadreth, right here as the second son of Finarfin, per the Silmarillion. In basically all of Tolkien's other writings, Odadreth is actually the son of Angrod, who we're going to talk about a little this week, but not in the Silmarillion. Christopher decided to use a very early version of this account of Odadreth, which makes him the brother. But if you go looking online, if you go to various wikis and fan-run resources all around the internet, you will hear people say that Odadreth is the son of Angrod, the grandson of Finarfin, which is true in almost all of Tolkien's writing, but not crucially in the finished, published Silmarillion. Angrod is going to be the first messenger of the Noldor to King Thingol. We're going to see that for sure tonight. We get a great moment in next week's reading too. Aegnor is... is the most minor of all of these third-generation characters, honestly. Is only ever referred to in the Silmarillion as a pair with his brother Angrod. His name only ever comes up in the form of Angrod and Aegnor, his brother, and that's it. So we don't really know that much about him. He doesn't really appear in these pages, though in the... I wanted to say extracurricular. That's not what I mean. In the expanded material, in the rest of the Legendarium, he is famously in love with a human woman named Andreth, and they have a really interesting relationship, and Andreth shows up in a really interesting scene that wrestles with some of the larger philosophical implications. At some point far in the future, we're going to get the opportunity to talk about the history of Middle-earth in its entirety, and that'll be a great day. That'll be a great 5-year project that we can undertake together. And lastly, of course, Galadriel, about whom nothing more need be said, except to note that I spent some time discussing Galadriel in the recent Q&A episode that just went out on the podcast feed, that just went out over on YouTube, talking about the lost lore of the Lady of Lothlorien, which is alliteratively pleasing, if in no other way. She's a fascinating character and continues to be a fascinating character. I have spent so much time this week reading about Galadriel just for my own personal edification. We're not going to talk about her tonight, hardly at all. We might just get to her at the end of tonight's reading. We'll see how it shakes out. So do check out that Q&A podcast if you're interested in more information on Galadriel. And now that we've been reacquainted with the sons and the grandsons of Finwë, with this house of Finwë just riven by the doom of the Noldor, Let's get into it. Let's rewind back before the awakening of man, back before the creation of the sun and the moon, to the flight of the Noldor and the crossing of the sea by Fëanor and his host. This is important just to set the stage for something that we're going to cover a little later in tonight's reading. I'm giving you a legitimate previously in the Silmarillion tonight, as we go and take a look at this exchange between Maedhros and his father. But when they were landed, Maedhros, the eldest of his sons, and on a time the friend of Fëanor, Morgoth Lies, came between, spoke to Fëanor, saying, "Now what ships and rowers will you spare to return, and whom shall they bring hither first? Fingon the valiant?" Then Fëanor laughed as one fey, and he cried, "None and none. What I have left behind I count now no loss. Needless baggage on the road it has proved. Let those that cursed my name curse me still, and wind their way back to the cages of the Valar. Let the ships burn." So this is the destruction of the swan boats of Alqualonde that Fëanor has used to cut across the Great Sea and arrive in Middle-earth, leaving behind Fingolfin's host. Of course, we talked about all of this previously, and we're calling this out here for two reasons. The first is to emphasize this friendship between Maedhros and Fingon, which is going to be so important in tonight's reading. The second is to kind of seed the ground here, just to lay a little track for a discussion of Féanus, which is going to be extremely important in just a couple of slides' time as we witness, well, the ultimate fate of Fëanor. So this happens. This is the burning of the swan boats. Fingolfin sees the flames from the boats from across the sea because the world is flat, so we don't have to worry about the curvature of the earth and the disappearing. I think it is easy to think that when Fingolfin sees the flames of the burning boats, that the world is, much smaller than it really is. But there is a great distance between Aman and Middle-earth, even in this northern latitude here. That's why the crossing of the Helcaraxa takes so long. It is possible, it is doable, but we're going to talk a little about the timeline and see exactly how long it takes Fingolfin's people to get there. And yes, as I say, the word Fae there. Oh, good. Glorfin David saying, the picture-in-picture with your live video is a great addition. Thanks. I do have this. This is just a thing that I can do all the time. I can't do it very often, though, because the slides just run too long. I try and keep my slides... I don't know. Is there wisdom in having a fewer number of slides, each of which is much longer and can't do the little picture-in-picture thing, can't make space for the little picture-in-picture? Or is there wisdom in doing a much larger number of slides where the text is more legible and I can be right here in the corner? I have no idea. You guys let me know. It's really up to you. This is an aesthetic choice. I'm an amateur scholar. I have little to say about aesthetics at this point. Okay, let's get into picking up 30 solar years, right? 30 of our years, 30 years of the sun on Middle-earth as we rewind to Fëanor. It has been told that Fëanor and his sons came first of the exiles to Middle-earth and landed in the waste of Lammoth, the great echo, upon the outer shores of the Firth of Drangest. And even as the Noldor set foot upon the strand, their cries were taken up into the hills and multiplied, so that a clamour as of countless mighty voices filled all the coasts of the north. And the noise of the burning of the ships at Losgar went down the winds of the sea as a tumult of great wrath, and far away all who heard that sound were filled with wonder. Now the flames of that burning were seen not only by Fingolfin, whom Fëanor had deserted in Ahriman, but also by the orcs and the watchers of Morgoth. No tale has told what Morgoth thought in his heart at the tiding that Fëanor, his bitterest foe, had brought a host out of the west. It may be that he feared him little, for he had as yet no proof of the swords of the Noldor, and soon it was seen that he purposed to drive them back into the sea. So a really great resetting of our expectation here, right? Not just coming from the creation of the sun and the moon, right? As we mentioned last week, a very textually different chapter, a very different style, a very different tone in that chapter. And then the coming of man, which is, again, a different kind of storytelling happening there. Now we're resetting back into the narrative as we understand it. So we're revisiting the arrival of Fëanor and the other exiles into Middle-earth, the burning of the boats, and the clamor that goes up, right? This countless mighty voices filled all the coasts of the north, right? This clamor of the Noldor arriving in Middle-earth is, of course, reflective of the reason that Lammoth is called Lammoth in the first place, right? This is where Morgoth calls out. The echoes of Morgoth's great cry during his confrontation with Ungoliant still echo in Lammoth. And now Fëanor has arrived and is doing the same thing. I don't know if it's become apparent at any point, but there are some similarities, I think, between Morgoth and Fëanor. More on that as we move forward. But what the narrative really does here is situates us back in this moment that is already familiar to us, but then pulls back the camera. It is a real... I don't know why I'm thinking of Battlestar Galactica with this. Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica reboot feels like a show that would show you something twice and then move the camera. I can't think of any specific instances. I have said now for, 5 or 6 years that it is maybe time for me to do a rewatch of Battlestar Galactica. Maybe I can find some kind of podcast space in which I can do that. But nonetheless, the orcs and the Watchers of Morgoth see the fire. They hear the cries of the Noldor come, and, well, we don't know what Morgoth thinks. This account has no record of what Morgoth thinks at this moment. We do know that he purposes to drive them back into the sea, as we're about to see, and he has as yet no proof of the swords of the Noldor, not proof of their existence. Of course, he knows of their existence, partly because he is the one who encouraged them in their making, in the smithing of swords and axes and spears, but proof of their efficacy, proof of their power, proof of the skill of the Noldor to wield these weapons, particularly against Morgoth's forces. So this carries us into the second major battle of Beleriand, the battle under the stars. Under the cold stars before the rising of the moon, the host of Fëanor went up the long firth of Drengis that pierced the echoing halls of Ered Lomin, and passed thus from the shores into the great land of Hithlum. And they came at length to the long lake of Mithrim, and upon its northern shore made their encampment in the region that bore the same name. But the host of Morgoth, arised by the tumult of Lamoth and the light of the burning at Losgar, came through the passes of Ered Wethrin, the mountain of shadow, and assailed Fëanor on a sudden, before his camp was full wrought or put in defence. And there on the grey fields of Mithrim was fought the second battle in the wars of Beleriand. Dagor Nuin Gileath it is named, the battle under stars, for the moon had not yet risen, and it is renowned in song. The Noldor, outnumbered and taken at unawares, were yet swiftly victorious, for the light of Aman had not yet dimmed in their eyes, and they were strong and swift and deadly in anger, and their swords were long and terrible. The orcs fled before them, and they were driven forth from Mithrim with great slaughter, and hunted over the mountains of shadow into the great plain of Ardgalan that lay northward of Dorthonion. There the armies of Morgoth that had passed south into the Vale of Sirion and beleaguered Círdan in the havens of the Falas came up to their aid and were caught in their ruin. For Celegorm, Fëanor's son, having news of them, waylaid them with a part of the elven host, and coming down upon them out of the hills near Eithel-Sinian, drove them to the fen of Sedech. Evil indeed were the tidings that came at last to Angband, and Morgoth was dismayed. 10 days that battle lasted, and from it returned of all the hosts that he had prepared for the conquest of Beleriand, no more than a handful of leaves. So as I say, this is the second battle of Beleriand. There are going to be arguably 5 or 6 battles of Beleriand, depending on whether you count the final War of Wrath as a battle of Beleriand or as something a little different. One of the most interesting things here is the way that these names escalate. It's really powerful to look at the way that Tolkien applies pressure to this crucible of Beleriand here. So the first battle, of course, is the conflict prior to the coming of the Noldor to Middle-earth, when it's the elves of Menegroth under Thingol, it's the elves of Assyriand under Denethor, it's the elves of Círdan at Eglarest, and the dwarves of the Ered Luin, too, coming into the army. That is where the orc army is pretty comprehensively crushed, but the Nandor, the elves of Denethor, retreat to the forests and then become the Lyquendi, the green elves, and they go forth no further. They don't wield weapons in the upcoming wars, they just kind of retreat into the shadows. And of course, Thingol simultaneously retreats to consolidate his hold on Doriath, safe there within the girdle of Melian. So that's the first battle, and its name is the first battle. But this is the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the battle under stars, and it gets a name. The second, though, it's a neutral description, right? It is simply an accounting of where and how and when it takes place. This is simply the battle under stars, because that's when it takes place, before the rising of the moon, right? The next battle is going to be known as the Dagor Aglareb, the glorious battle. So you can see the step up there, right? It's actually an active description. The first battle, the battle under the stars, then the glorious battle. Then the fourth is going to be the battle of sudden flame, the Dagor Bragalach, which is going to be a real, I mean, each of these battles are, in their way, I suppose, a turning point here as we move through the history of Beleriand. The fifth battle, the Nirnath Ainodiad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, as was prophesied by Mandos back in Valinor, and then we get to the War of Wrath. I just really love seeing Tolkien, I don't know, really apply like a kind of taxonomic pressure, like a nominative pressure to the evolution of these battles. Each one more dramatic, each one with a grander name. Though this is grand. This isn't a mere skirmish. It sounds pretty intense. 10 days that battle lasted, and from it returned of all the hosts that he had prepared, that Morgoth had prepared for the conquest of Beleriand, no more than a handful of leaves. Another just ruinous victory at the a ruinous defeat for Morgoth at the hands of the victorious elves, fresh from Valinor, with the light of Aman not yet dimmed in their eyes, strong and swift, deadly in anger, and their swords were long and terrible. Right? The elves are taking the orcs apart at this point. But it's no trivial conflict. 10 days that battle lasted, but this is the battle under the stars. We have not yet transitioned to the years of the sun. We haven't yet transitioned to our new method of timing time in Middle-earth. So that means that we're still on Vailian years. We're still on Vailian days. A Vailian day is 3.5 solar days, 3.5 of our days, which means that this battle rages for more than a month. It's pretty dramatic, though it's nothing compared to what happens after the battle is won. I've entitled the next slide, The Death of Fëanor. No, really. Yet cause he had for great joy, though it was hidden from him for a while. For Fëanor in his wrath against the enemy would not halt, but pressed on behind the remnant of the orcs, thinking so to come at Morgoth himself. And he laughed aloud as he wielded his sword, rejoicing that he had dared the wrath of the Valar and the evils of the road, that he might see the hour of his vengeance. Nothing did he know of Angband, or the great strength of defence that Morgoth had so swiftly prepared. But even had he known it, it would not have deterred him, for he was fey, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. Thus it was that he drew far ahead of the van of his host, and seeing this, the servants of Morgoth turned to bay, and there issued from Angband Balrogs to aid them. There, upon the confines of Dor Daedaloth, the land of Morgoth, Fëanor was surrounded with few friends about him. Long he fought on, and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire and wounded with many wounds. But at the last he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, lord of the Balrogs, whom Ecthelion after slew in Gondolin. There he would have perished had not his sons in that moment come up with force to his aid, and the Balrogs left him and departed to Angband. Then his sons raised up their father and bore him back toward Mithrim. But as they drew near to Ithilcidion and were upon the upward path to the pass over the mountains, Fëanor bade them halt, for his wounds were mortal, and he knew that his hour was come. And looking out from the slopes of Erod Wethrin, with his last sight he beheld far off the peaks of Thangorodrim, mightiest of the towers of Middle-earth, and he knew with foreknowledge of death that no power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them. But he cursed the name of Morgoth thrice, and laid it upon his sons to hold to their oath, and to avenge their father. Then he died, but he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit that as it sped his body fell to ash and was borne away like smoke, and his likeness had never again appeared in Arda, neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. Thus ended the mightiest of the Noldor, of whose deeds came both the greatest renown and their most grievous woe. All this time with Fëanor, and here he is casually dying in like the third slide of this chapter. This is incredibly powerful stuff, and it is, of course, foreshadowed. Remember back in chapter 7, when Fëanor creates the Silmarils, the narrator casually tells us that no one knows what the Silmarils are made of, and that no one will know until the end of days, because Fëanor perishes ere the sun was made, and sits now in the halls of awakening and comes no more among his kin. That is chapter 7. And then chapter 11 starts the ticking clock with the creation of the sun, right? In chapter 7, we don't even know what the sun is. Chapter 11, it shows up, and we know that time is short. We rewind just a little bit, and here we are, Fëanor, finished. Dor Daedaloth there, the land of Morgoth, the actual literal translation is land of shadow and horror. It's easy, I think, to read this as a consequence of Fëanor's arrogance and wrath and jealousy, his desperate commitment to retrieving the Silmarils. And all of that is to some extent true, but here we get a classic moment of Tolkien rhyming with his subsequent stories, because Fëanor isn't just furious, he isn't just arrogant, he isn't just dangerous, he is fey. And that is one of Tolkien's most heavy-hitting words, right? Even had he had known it, it would not have deterred him, for he was fey, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. And fey, well, fey is important, and fey, crucially, is different than simply wrathful or vengeful or prideful. It is a different state of being, because it tells us something about the moment in which the character finds him or herself. I want to scrub out of this for just a moment to show you excerpts from The Lord of the Rings. Have you guys heard of this book, The Lord of the Rings? It's really good. Here are some excerpts. This is almost every excerpt, all but one, of The Lord of the Rings in which the word fey is used. And I want to study these very briefly just to look at what Tolkien means when he describes Fëanor here as being fey. So the first quote comes from Book 4, Chapter 8, Shelob's Lair. This is, of course, Sam, horrified by Frodo rushing on ahead. Dread was round him and enemies before him in the pass, and his master was in a fey mood, running heedlessly to meet them. Is Frodo in this moment Fey or not Fey? A little. It's a little dubious. Probably not completely, but yeah, there's something happening to Frodo in that moment for sure. The second comes from Book 5, Chapter 3, The Muster of Rohan, as Éowyn is describing Aragorn going to the paths of the dead, right? Éowyn says, "Greatly changed he seems to me since I saw him first in the king's house. Grimmer, older, Fey I thought him, and like one whom the dead call." Which is literally true. But not figuratively true. Aragorn at this point, not Fey. Aragorn actually pursuing a strategy that he believes has some chance of success. Book 5, Chapter 4, just the next chapter. Right? You'll see here, most of these are taken from Book 5. Most of these are taken from subsequent chapters, in fact, because that's when the emotional intensity, the militaristic energy of The Lord of the Rings is really at its peak. So in Chapter 4, The Siege of Gondor, we have Pippin describing Denethor's state of mind, right? He's talking to Beleriand, the guard here. "No," said Pippin, "not yet. And even now his death may be prevented, I think. But the lord of the city, Beleriand, has fallen before his city is taken. He is fey and dangerous." Quickly he told of Denethor's strange words and deeds. "I must find Gandalf at once." Is Pippin right about Denethor? Yes, I think we can be pretty confident that Denethor is fey in this moment. And then we have possibly the most famous example. This is the only instance of the name of one of the Valar in The Lord of the Rings, even though no one reading The Lord of the Rings upon its publication would have any idea who Orome is. This is the description of Theoden King riding out with the Rohirrim. This is from Book 5, Chapter 5, The Ride of the Rohirrim. "Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up on snowmen like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young." I mean, just fantastic. You can feel the blood rise even in that moment. And then from the following chapter, Book 5, Chapter 6, The Battle of the Pelennor Fields. "He stood a moment as a man who was pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart, and then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him so that all speech failed him for a while. A fey mood took him." This is, of course, Éomer after witnessing the death of Theoden King and believing Éowyn to be dead too. This is when he leads the Rohirrim into the final fray, calling out that immortal line, "Death, ride to ruin and the world's ending." Battle of the Pelennor Fields, you guys. Pretty great thing to discuss. So through all of this, we can see what being fey means, right? We can see what Tolkien intends through his use of this word. It is a kind of disassociative moment, I think. Let's talk a little about this principle of rhyming with himself here, because rather than relying on this imprecise language of rhyme, and generally because it's good, I think, for the soul not to give George Lucas too much credit for things that are out with his control, let's add the technical term to our quiver of analytical tools. This is technically typology, right? Nothing to do with the layout of text or the selection of fonts, but the study of types, rather the study, particularly in the text of the Bible, of these recurring figures and forms and archetypes and metaphors. I am not, I'm afraid to say, though I'm sure it will come as no surprise, enough of a biblical scholar to be really able to distinguish many of those forms and types within the frame of the Bible, but it is used as an analytical tool to distinguish and draw comparison between the Old Testament and the New, primarily, right? To prefigure certain elements in the New Testament in the Old Testament, to echo them or to reflect them, to invert them, to subvert them, and to bring them in a kind of narrative fruition in the New Testament there. It's also completely common through all of the classical mythologies. I think it is, again, declaiming a huge thing here, so I want to pause just for a moment to see if anything jumps out at me as an obvious counterexample. I think it is an inevitable consequence of having a large and clustered set of paratexts. I think that, or of intertexts, I suppose I should say. I think that anytime you are getting many stories told from many different perspectives about the same set of characters or set of events, you're going to wind up echoing elements through different parts of the story. And that is certainly what Professor Tolkien is doing here. And for those of you who are coming in late, that is what George Lucas claims to have been doing through the Star Wars series. And though I think George Lucas's claims are soft in this regard, there certainly are moments of reflection. There are moments of real typological intent, right? There are moments of rhyming in George Lucas's work through the Star Wars films, and other people's work, many other people's work through the Star Wars films too. So Tolkien is rhyming with himself. He is engaging in this kind of typological association, right? First we establish something and then we return to that thing, usually in a lower key or in a different octave, as I've said before, right? We replay these same sets of scenarios in order to understand something that is fundamentally true about the world. Something recurs here because it is, capital T, true, because it is a part of the fabric of Arda as it is created. And what we're seeing here, I think, is this echo of Fëanor. And Fëanor is literally like a death certainty. It is the thing that comes upon you when you realize that there is no hope, that there's no sense in struggle, when your defiance has been crushed, when despair is upon you, you become Fë. You enter into that moment before your imminent demise, right? That is what we see in Theoden King rushing to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, right? That is what we see in Éomer. Now, it doesn't work out for Éomer. It doesn't always work out, as the thing about being Fë in the works of Tolkien. He uses this as an indication that you are beyond the reach of hope, that you are beyond the reach of action, of decision, that you are now just caught in this moment that you cannot escape, and which you feel with absolute certainty, with absolute clarity, beyond the shadow of a doubt, will lead to your imminent death. That is what it is to be Fë. So let's take a look back at that other slide. Let me see if I can struggle through this to call it up. There we are. Okay. So the point is this, right? To be Fë is to be driven beyond thought, to be driven beyond reason, to believe that all of the boundless ambiguity and endless possibility of the immediate future have collapsed to the single terminal point. And what we're seeing here from Fëanor is a true moment of foresight. He knows what is going to happen next, but he cannot change his path. Nothing did he know of Angband or the great strength of defense that Morgoth had so swiftly prepared, but even had he known it, it would not have deterred him, for he was Fë, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. So we're seeing this foresight, and I stress this because it goes a long way to clarify and sustain what we might think of as the Fëanor problem, right? Is Fëanor a hero? Is he a villain? Is he a king? Is he a monster? Well, the answers are yes, 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 and absolutely yes. And Tolkien is taking care here not to give us a simple character arc. He's not just a villain. By suspending this moment, by holding it unresolved as we move forward, by taking even from Fëanor the choice to stop, right? That's one of the things that being Fë removes from you is the choice to back down, is the choice to retreat, the choice to be cautious. He removes that from Fëanor and attributes to Fëanor a sense of imminent destiny that is outside of Fëanor himself. He could have just told us, right, that Fëanor was rushing forth heedless and wrathful and filled with fury and jealousy and eager to tear the Silmarils from the iron crown of Morgoth. But by making him Fë, Tolkien's reminding us, to some extent, that this is a moment, this is a thing that is happening to Fëanor, not just a thing that Fëanor is doing, not to, break the mood or to suggest an image of Fëanor, I don't know, pouting and wearing a My Chemical Romance t-shirt, telling his dad, I didn't ask to be born with the strength that could have nourished the life of many gone forth into me. But, Fëanor didn't ask to be born like this, with this excess of power and strength. We can talk and we can argue about, not argue, of course, not here amongst the Silmarillion heirs. We can talk and we can debate. We can debate about Fëanor. But Tolkien's intent, I think, is inescapable. Fëanor is unambiguously a hero, the greatest of his age. Fëanor is unambiguously a villain. He is the original sinner of the elves in Arda. Both these things are true, which is what makes his story a tragedy. We ought to compare Fëanor not to Saruman, right? Though Saruman arguably is a tragic figure in his own way, but Fëanor is not like Saruman. Fëanor has not fallen in the way that Saruman falls. Fëanor has fallen more like Thorin Oakenshield, more like Boromir, more like, ultimately, Smeagol. And we can understand the tragedy of those figures, though the tragedy of Fëanor is harder to get to emotionally, simply because Fëanor is of such enormous stature, right? Because he is the most powerful of the Noldor. And I guess I'm distinguishing here between the kind of colloquial use of the word tragedy, right? Just a terrible thing that has happened, and this ancient Greek Aristotelian concept of tragedy, this concept of the flawed hero who makes the wrong choice because of his internal weakness and causes, per Aristotle in the Poetics, right? One of the things that tragedy does, according to Aristotle in the Poetics, is make the audience feel both pity and fear. And we do, I think, feel both pity and fear, particularly as Fëanor, in this last moment, in perhaps his least forgivable moment, looks up at Thangorodrim, the volcanoes raised by Morgoth over Angband, and realizes that there was no way that he could have taken them. No power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them, right? We specifically acknowledge this foreknowledge of death. No power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them. But does he tell his sons to turn around and go back to Valinor? Does he tell his sons to bolster the defenses of Beleriand? Does he tell his sons to seek some other solution to the Morgoth problem? No, he doesn't. He holds them to their oath. He charges them to avenge their father. And you'll note, there's no discussion here of avenging their grandfather. Remember that excuse for the undertaking of this whole perilous adventure, right? One of the things that we were doing, absolutely, we'll get the Silmarils back. That's less important, obviously, than avenging the death of Finwë at Morgoth's hand. No, there's no mention of Finwë. All of that excuse has fallen out of the narrative at this point. It is now just about the Silmarils, and now it is just about avenging Fëanor too. This is, I would say, per Tolkien, a moment of possible redemption, right? One of the reasons that I'm putting this moment from Fëanor up against these other moments of characters being Fae is that there are, in many of these moments, in many of these tragic moments, opportunities for redemption, right? I'm thinking of Thorin Oakenshield sallying forth from Erebor, wading into the Battle of the Five Armies, not staying reclusive, right? But actually getting out there to help his friends and allies. That is a moment of redemption for Thorin Oakenshield at the end of The Hobbit. I'm thinking of Boromir fighting desperately to defend Merry and Pippin at Parth Galen after confronting Frodo on Amon Hen and trying to take the ring, right? He dies in the defense of these hobbits, partly as an expiation of his sin, right? Partly as a counterbalance to the moment of temptation that cracks him. This is a moment of redemption for him. We don't know for sure if Fëanor has the moral authority, if anybody has the moral authority to free the sons of Fëanor from their terrible oath, but maybe in this moment he could have tried, but instead he doubles down and he dies in darkness, borne away like smoke. I'm noticing here in the chat, Glad Rebecca calling out the inevitable, it's not even a pun, right? It's just a connection. Fëanor. Here is Fëanor. He is Fae. He is Fëanor. I mean, etymologically, this is one of these things that I wonder if Tolkien even noticed, right? This is one of these moments where I think, did you know the hill was named Tuna? Did it ever cross your mind that was weird? Did you include it as a joke? Yeah. Fae, of course, meaning fire, right? He is the spirit of fire. He is possessed of Fëa. He has more Fëa than anyone else. He's got so much Fëa that it basically drains his mother of her life. And that brings him his greatness. But yes, is this the end point of one possessed of so much spirit that your spirit eventually overwhelms you, right? You can see the balance there, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. And of course, we have to observe, as we always do with Fëanor, how frequently we're leaning into metaphor and imagery of fire surrounding Fëanor. Not least of all, of course, in this moment of his death. Then he died, but he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit that as it sped, his body fell to ash, and it was borne away like smoke. And his likeness was never again appeared in Arda, neither has his spirit left the halls of Mandos. So his body is consumed by the departure of his spirit, or simply that his spirit is no longer sustaining the raw material, right? The material of earth that is his body. I'm reminded, of course, about that passage that we discussed just last week, where we were talking about the diminution of the elves, right? In those days, the elves were still of a like stature to men, but because their bodies had not yet been consumed by their spirits, their bodies had not yet been consumed by their Fëa. Well, this is a body being absolutely consumed by the exit of a Fëa, right? His spirit flies out to the halls of Mandos. I don't want to necessarily include that. I'm finding myself, as I'm doing all this research and as I'm really trying to wrestle with the entire breadth of the Legendarium, in order to, one of the tiny like side quests that I've been engaged in through this unit of Stars and Swords is looking at what Christopher Tolkien has done in terms of his selection process and his biases, right? I was talking last week. I was talking, in fact, in the Q&A episode about how the construction of a secondary creation, how the telling of a story reveals the underlying ideology of the writer, right? It happens all the time. It is inescapable. It's one of the problems with Death of the Author as a kind of, as a philosophical platform, right? Is that you just can't divorce the author from the text, because the text is just about the author's unique and specific perspective. You can divorce the biographical information as much as you can, but the author or the author function per Foucault is still within the text. And I'm looking at this text as something that was selected and created by Christopher Tolkien, and I'm wondering about his choices, and I'm wondering about his inclusions, and I'm wondering about why he selected the stories that he did. He's looking mostly for comprehensivity. He's looking for completion more than anything else, but he's also making some changes, and he's making some selections, and he's making some odd choices, right? And we're going to talk about this when we get to the geography of Beleriand. I'm not sure why that chapter exists in this book. I don't hate it the way that some people hate it, but some people hate it, and it doesn't need to be in the book, really. We don't get that much from it. But I think that what Christopher Tolkien is doing there is bringing in some of his own affection for his father's work, respect for his father's work, and that's why we're including so much of that text. And I say this because I'm filtering through a lot of the other versions of these stories that we get through the history of Middle-earth and through the Lost Tales and the Unfinished Tales and all the other books that surround the kind of the core, quote-unquote, canon of Tolkien's work, of The Hobbit, of The Lord of the Rings, of the Silmarillion, though even the canonical status of the Silmarillion is dubious for some readers. I'm looking through some of this material, and some of it is just genuinely great. Some of it is just genuinely great. And I bring this up to acknowledge that there is a version in other parts of Tolkien's writing of the end times, of what happens after the end of history, in effect, as we are moving toward the rebuilding of a new and better and stronger, faster, sexier Arda than we've ever had before. And Fëanor is mentioned as finally leaving the halls of Mandos. And the reason that Fëanor is allowed to leave the halls of Mandos is to do one thing, and that is surrender the Silmarils to Yavanna, which I just think is fantastic. I think that is so poetic and so beautifully balanced. And it's an aching reminder, I think, that even for all the work that we have, for all the brilliant academic work that Christopher Tolkien undertook through his life, and for all the fantastic academic work that has happened and is continuing to happen today, this podcast least of all, of course, for all of that, these stories are unfinished. All of them are effectively unfinished. None of them are complete as they should be in the mind of the author, and that is just an ongoing pain, I think, that I'm just going to have for the rest of my life. I think it's just a difficult thing to know that this is never going to be done. I was wrestling with the idea of how would I feel about someone going through and writing like a complete version of the story of Galadriel. And I'm not talking about the Children of Húrin or the Fall of Gondolin or, anything that's kind of a more completed form of the original writings of Tolkien put together by Christopher, right? We've got these extra volumes, these more complete versions of the story. But if someone took a part of the Legendarium that is underdeveloped or is essentially contradictory or that doesn't even exist at all and tried to put it together, would I applaud that? And the answer is I wouldn't. The answer is I wouldn't applaud it. But also there is a part of me that wants it. And maybe this is why people like fan fiction. One of the curious things about me is that I find it difficult in my heart of hearts to care that much about fan fiction. And we're going to talk about fan fiction as we discuss Rings of Power and probably the Hobbit movies too in the months to come. Let's get back to our discussion here. You can see why this is going to take us so long to get through tonight. So Fëanor is borne away as smoke. His body is consumed. This is, in some sense, the inevitable conclusion of Fëanor's story. There's a feeling that you get when you reach this point that it was just always going to happen like this. But this is not, by any stretch, the end of the tragedies that will befall the Noldor in Beleriand. Now in Mithrim there dwelt grey elves, folk of Beleriand that had wandered north over the mountains, and the Noldor met them with gladness, as kinsfolk long sundered. But speech at first was not easy between them, for in their long severance the tongues of the Calaquendi in Valinor and the Morriquendi in Beleriand had drawn far apart. From the elves of Mithrim the Noldor learned of the power of Elu Thingol, king in Doriath, and the girdle of enchantment that fenced his realm. The tidings of these great deeds in the north came south to Menegroth, and to the havens of Brithombar and Eglarest. Then all of the elves of Beleriand were filled with wonder and with hope at the coming of their mighty kindred, who thus returned unlooked for from the west in the very hour of their need, believing indeed at first that they had come as emissaries of the Valar to deliver them. But even in the hour of the death of Fëanor, an embassy came to his sons from Morgoth, acknowledging defeat and offering terms, even to the surrender of a Silmaril. Then Maedhros the Tall, the eldest son, persuaded his brothers to feign to treat with Morgoth and to meet his emissaries at the place appointed, but the Noldor had as little thought of faith as had he. Wherefore each embassy came with greater force than was agreed, but Morgoth sent the more, and there were Balrogs. Maedhros was ambushed, and all his company were slain, but he himself was taken alive by the command of Morgoth and brought to Angband. Then the brothers of Maedhros drew back and fortified a great camp in Hithlam, But Morgoth held Maedhros as hostage and sent word that he would not release him until the Noldor would forsake their war, returning into the west, or else departing far from Beleriand into the south of the world. But the sons of Fëanor knew that Morgoth would betray them, and would not release Maedhros whatsoever they might do, and so they were constrained also by their oath, and might not for any cause forsake the war against the enemy. Therefore Morgoth took Maedhros and hung him from the face of a precipice upon Thangorodrim, and he was caught to the rock by the wrist of his right hand in a band of steel. So there's so much here, right? First of all, of course, out of deference to Professor Tolkien, we have to acknowledge the linguistic element of this story, that these languages have diverged in the time that these elves have been apart. The Calaquendian Valinor and the Morroquendian Beleriand have drawn apart in terms of their language, so they cannot immediately, readily understand one another. That is going to be particularly significant in the chapters to come. So they learn of Eleuthingel, they learn of the Girdle of Melian. We get this moment of hope, this moment of false hope here. And we're going to learn more specifically why this hope is false when we send a specific emissary to Menegroth to talk with Thingol in the pages to come. But all of the elves of Beleriand at this moment, filled with wonder and with hope at the coming of their mighty kindred, who thus returned unlooked for out of the west in the very hour of their need. Oh my God, this feels like eucatastrophe. This feels like the kind of thing that happens in a Tolkien story. The orcs are pouring forth from Angband. Terrible things await us out there in the darkness. And now a host of the mightiest elves who have ever lived, charged with the power of Aman, cross over the great sea and come to our rescue. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens in our darkest hour, per the rules of Tolkien's Legendarium. But of course, this is a dramatic irony, because we know what the elves of Doriath do not know. We know what Thingol doesn't, and that is that it's more complicated than he sees. But then we pivot away, right? Because we haven't done the conflict yet. We're not finished yet. Even in the hour of the death of Fëanor, an embassy comes to his sons. Morgoth pretending to surrender. We assume pretending to surrender, right? He does bring armed guards to their meeting and their parley here, right? He acknowledges defeat, offers terms, even to the surrender of a Silmaril, while he's tempting them with the one thing that he knows they can't resist. And Maedhros says, great, let's go to this parley. Let's go and talk with Morgoth. We are, of course, going to immediately betray him. The problem is, Morgoth is playing the same game, betrays them much harder, right? Morgoth sent the Moor, and there were Balrogs, and I've talked so many times now about how fully and completely Tolkien understands the syntactical principle of end weight, right? The idea that the word at the end of the sentence in English carries extra weight. And Tolkien is a master of this because of his interest in languages which are syntactically very different from modern English, languages in which words occupy specific positions within the sentence. Thus, there's no inflection to the words themselves, because where the word is tells you everything you need to know. If the word is in this particular spot, then it is the subject of the sentence. If the word is in this other spot, the word itself doesn't change, but it becomes the object of the sentence. That's the kind of language structures that Tolkien knows through his studies of Old English and Anglo-Saxon languages. This is an area, I should say, in which I am woefully undereducated, but would love to become more educated. So if you know of any good resources about this stuff, then please do get in touch. I am just familiar with the outline, with the shape of it. But what I can tell you from my study of this is that Tolkien has mastered end weight. When we put words at the end of the sentence, even if it is grammatically somewhat unbalanced, even if it is grammatically unconventional, then they are more powerful. And here it's not even grammatically unconventional. And there were Balrogs is maybe the simplest sentence in the entire Silmarillion that gets the hair on the back of your neck to stand up. So Maedhros is captured, right? Morgoth sent the Moor, and there were Balrogs. Maedhros was ambushed and all his company were slain. He himself was taken alive by the command of Morgoth and brought to Angband. He tries to persuade the Noldor, the sons of Fëanor, to retreat, but they can't. They also don't trust him. They know that he will betray them, and they were constrained also by their oath and might not for any cause forsake the war against the enemy. Therefore Morgoth took Maedhros and hung him from the face of a precipice upon Thangorodrim, and he was caught to the rock by the wrist of his right hand in a band of steel. And if you're reading this as a newcomer to the Silmarillion, maybe you're thinking, that sounds kind of familiar. If we're talking about spirits of fire, Fëanor here, right? If we're talking about fire and this kind of otherworldly retribution, if we're talking about punishment, we might be reminded of the fate of Prometheus in Greek myth. Per Hesiod, Prometheus steals back the fire that Zeus withdraws from humanity. This is part of the, One of the perspectives that Hesiod takes on the Promethean myth that is a little atypical, but I really like it, is that basically Zeus looks down and decides, no, not fire though. Fire is too dangerous, and he takes it away. Prometheus steals it back, and as punishment is chained to the Caucasus, and an eagle consumes his liver every day. And there are too many similarities here, I think, for Tolkien to have been unaware of the reference. But we're doing something here with fire. We're doing something with the sins of the fathers. We're doing something, obviously, with eagles, as we'll get to in a moment. But what we're not doing is what? Heroicizing? We're not valorizing Maedhros here. It's tempting to see him as a heroic character, certainly more heroic than his father. But we see here, again, this arrogance. We see here, again, crucially, a willing, even eager duplicity as he enters into this parley with the intention of betraying Morgoth. That is not a thing that good people do, you guys. That is not a cool thing. This is the oath of Fëanor and his sons kind of coming to the forefront of his mind once again. Maedhros is an incredibly complicated character, much more nuanced in his drive, in his compulsion, in his obedience to his oath than his father was, but for all that more crunchy. There's something about Maedhros that I find really, really fascinating here. But what Tolkien is doing here, I think, is making it clear that though Fëanor is dead and gone, his influence isn't. It still isn't enough for the bad guy to be gone. Someone good has to build a better world, right? Or the wounds caused by the bad guy, the wounds inflicted upon the world by the bad guy, will still sour and rot the world. Which takes us, of course, to Fingolfin. Now rumour came to the camp in Hithlum of the march of Fingolfin and those that followed him, who had crossed the grinding ice, and all the world lay then in wonder at the coming of the moon. But as the host of Fingolfin marched into Mithrim, the sun rose flaming in the west, and Fingolfin unfurled his blue and silver banners, and blew his horns, and flowers sprang beneath his marching feet, and the ages of the stars was ended. At the uprising of the great light, the servants of Morgoth fled into Angband, and Fingolfin passed unopposed through the fastness of Dor Daedaloth, while his foes hid beneath the earth. Then the elves smote upon the gates of Angband, and the challenge of their trumpets shook the towers of Thangorodrim, and Maedhros heard them amid his torment, and cried aloud, but his voice was lost in the echoes of the stone. But Fingolfin, being of other temper than Fëanor, and wary of the wiles of Morgoth, withdrew from Dor Daedaloth, and turned back toward Mithrim, for he had heard tidings that he should find the sons of Fëanor, and he desired also to have the shield of the Mountains of Shadow while his people rested and grew strong, for he had seen the strength of Angband, and thought not that it would fall to the sound of trumpets only. Therefore, coming at length to Hithlum, he made his first camp and dwelling by the northern shores of Lake Mithrim. No love was there in the hearts of those that followed Fingolfin for the house of Fëanor, for the agony of those that endured the crossing of the ice had been great, and Fingolfin held the sons as accomplices of their father. Then there was peril of strife between the hosts, but grievous were the losses upon the road, and the people of Fingolfin and of Finrod, son of Finarfin, were still more numerous than the followers of Fëanor, and these now withdrew before them, and removed their dwelling to the southern shore, and the lake lay between them. Many of Fëanor's people indeed repented of the burning at Losgar, and were filled with amazement at the valour that had brought the friends whom they had abandoned over the ice of the north, and they would have welcomed them, but they dared not, for shame. So, let's remember that Fingon here rules the faction of his kin that were ruled by his father Finarfin, who returned to Tirion upon Tuna, right, to rule the Noldor and Valinor after the kinslaying of the Teleri at Alqualande. That is why Finarfin is not here with us. He was the one that returned. Fingolfin, obviously a wiser leader than Fëanor was, thereby occupying a category of being that includes every single person on the face of Middle-earth, and builds a camp to rebuild the strength of his people rather than confront Morgoth in that moment of wrath, right? And we'll notice crucially, because this is going to be a very specific point that Tolkien makes over and again as we move forward, right? Notice that he doesn't choose not to rescue Maedhros. He doesn't know about Maedhros. Maedhros' voice, even as he hears him amid his torment and cries aloud, is lost in the echoes of the stone. So it's curious here to look at the coming of Fingolfin, right? The crossing of the ice is such a phenomenal thing to do, right? We've been told before that of the deeds of the Noldor, like, it ranks way, way up there, as you can see from the response of the elves of Beleriand. They're startled by the accomplishment here. But it's not just as simple as the phenomenal accomplishment of crossing the Helcaraxe. It is also arriving with the sun at his back, right? As the host, or I guess not at his back, crucially in front of him. But as the host of Fingolfin marched into Mithrim, the sun rose flaming in the west. This is the first time that this has happened. The sun, I guess, you know what? Let me correct that. The sun is rising in the west because it is the first time, and Fingolfin unfurls his blue and silver banner. So the sun is rising from behind him. The light is shining from the west because we have not yet reset the combative celestial mechanics that we need to protect there. As Galadriel Becky is saying here, like Gandalf. Yes, absolutely, like Gandalf, right? Again, we're echoing here. We're seeing some of this same imagery. You arrive with the sunlight. You arrive with the coming of day. And I'm assuming, Galadriel Becky, that you're thinking of Gandalf encountering the trolls in the beginning of The Hobbit. That's obviously the moment where Gandalf arrives with the sunlight, right? So we're seeing here, I don't know, a more measured, more counseled, more thoughtful version of what the Noldor should be like, right? In this moment, even as they settle on the shores of Lake Hithram, that Fingolfin's people come to the camp of the Sons of Fëanor, and there's going to be strife. There's going to be enmity here because he sees them as being, willing accomplices of their father, and is correct in that. They took the same oath for sure. And they split. Presumably, Fëanor's people are now under the rule of Maglor the Singer, right? The second son of Fëanor, because Fëanor is dead and Maedhros is all chained up upon Thangorodrim. I imagine that Maglor is taking the lead there, and they resettle on the southern shore of the lake, while Fingolfin and Fingon's people take the northern shore. I want to observe, too, here, this last line. They would have welcomed them, but they dared not for shame, right? Some of Fëanor's people are already repenting their actions, right? They're repenting the burning of the boats at Losgar. They're filled with amazement at the valor that brought their friends whom they had abandoned over the ice of the north. They left these people behind, and now they have showed up having accomplished something unparalleled, unrivaled by any of the people of Fëanor, by any of the House of Fëanor here. They're stunned. They would have welcomed them, but they dared not for shame. And again, a moment of association, of symmetry with Morgoth here. You'll remember in the Ainulindalë when Ilúvatar tells Melkor for the first time to knock it off, and we get this line, Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. Shame is a dark thing that turns sour within the heart, that leads to a harvest of anger and of wrath. So we can't reconcile these branches of the Noldori here. We can't bring these houses, these kinfolk, let's remember that, back together. All these sons of Finwë, we cannot bring them back together because of this secret shame, this shame over the deeds that they have done. So we need someone to step in. We need someone to do the deed. We need someone to repair these breaches and to fix things that have gone wrong. And of course, we are talking about Fingon the Valiant. Thus, because of the curse that lay upon them, the Noldor achieved nothing, while Morgoth hesitated, and the dread of light was new and strong upon the orcs. But Morgoth arose from thought, and seeing the division of his foes, he laughed. In the pits of Angband he caused vast smokes and vapours to be made, and they came forth from the reeking tops of the Iron Mountains, and afar off they could be seen in Mithrim, staining the bright airs in the first mornings of the world. A wind came out of the east, and bore them over Hithlum, darkening the new sun, and they fell, and coiled about the fields and hollows, and lay upon the waters of Mithrim drear and poisonous. Then Fingon, the valiant, son of Fingolfin, resolved to heal the feud that divided the Noldor before their enemy should be ready for war. For the earth trembled in the Northlands with the thunder of the forges of Morgoth underground. Long before in the bliss of Valinor, before Melkor was unchained or lies came between them, Fingon had been close in friendship with Maedhros. And though he knew not yet that Maedhros had not forgotten him at the burning of the ships, the thought of their ancient friendship stung his heart. Therefore he dared a deed which is justly renowned among the feats of the princes of the Noldor. Alone, and without the counsel of any, he set forth in search of Maedhros, and aided by the very darkness that Morgoth had made, he came unseen into the fastness of his foes. High upon the shoulders of Thangorodrim he climbed, and looked in despair upon the desolation of the land, but no passage or crevice could he find through which he might come within Morgoth's stronghold. Then, in defiance of the orcs who cowered still in the dark vaults beneath the earth, he took his harp, and sang a song of Valinor that the Noldor made of old before strife was born among the sons of Finwë, and his voice rang in the mournful hollows that had never heard before aught save cries of fear and woe. So, The doom of the Noldor, the treason of kin unto kin and fear of treason shall this come to pass, right? The dispossessed shall they be forever. This is the doom of the Noldor that is delivered by Maedhros. Because of the curse that laid upon the Noldor, they achieved nothing. But simultaneously, Morgoth is hesitating. This dread of light, the sun has come and driven all of his many forces underground. We have kind of completed the arc that I began discussing last week, right? It is with the coming of the sun, first with the coming of the moon, but then with the coming of the sun, that darkness becomes the sole preserve of evil. We begin at this point to continually, to constantly, if not comprehensively, treat darkness as a manifestation of the foe, a manifestation of the enemy, that darkness is itself home to dangerous things. We're going to counterbalance that, when we get to the Lord of the Rings and we see the elves under starlight, we're going to still see some of their joy, some of the beauty of the world before the sun arose, but it's going to be more complicated in the future. And even then, we're going to be talking about lights, we're going to be talking about lamps, and we're going to be talking about torches, and we're going to be talking about things which defy the starlit darkness. We will never again enjoy the starlit darkness of Varda in the same way as we did before the sun was made. And the consequence of that, of course, is that the evil things now lurk in this darkness, that they retreat below the earth. So Morgoth conspires to bring forth these poisonous fumes once again, right? It's the same old trick. It's just what he saw Ungoliant do back during their lightning raid on Valinor in the first place, right? He's just bringing forth these smokes and vapors, these reeks, the reeking tops of the Iron Mountains, bringing that vapor down to lay upon the waters of Mithrim, drear and poisonous. And thus, Fingon the Valiant, son of Fingolfin, resolves to heal the feud that divided the Noldor. And I think it's really tempting sometimes to look at this. Look, let's face it, this story is great, right? Fingon thinking of the friendship of Maedhros, feeling the sting of that friendship in his heart, and going forth to rescue his friend is a great story. That is just a cool thing to do. There is a reason that Fingon is many people's favorite character in this book. But that's not his motivation. That's not the first thing that he thinks of. Fingon the Valiant, son of Fingolfin, resolved to heal the feud that divided the Noldor before their enemies should be ready for war, for the earth trembled in the Northlands with the thunder of the forges of Morgoth underground. He, and by all accounts, he alone, sees the danger that is coming. He understands the danger of the division of the Noldor. If they cannot unite, if they cannot come together to face this common foe, right? A foe that does not care which branch of Finway's family you come from, he's going to kill you all. If they can't come together, then they will be destroyed. So he sets out with the intent of healing this feud, of reforging this sense of belonging in the hearts of the children of Finwë. And he does so by going after Maedhros, right? Long before, in the bliss of Valinor, before Melkor was unchained or lies came between them, Fingon had been close in friendship with Maedhros. And again, crucially, right? It's not that Fingolfin chooses not to rescue Maedhros when he gets to the gates of Angband. He doesn't know that he's there. Fingon, here, he doesn't know that Maedhros has thought of him too. He doesn't know that Maedhros has reciprocally kind of felt the sting of their friendship over the long miles, that he spoke to his father, Fingon's name, Fingon the Valiant, after crossing the Great Sea in the Swanboats, that he wanted their friendship to be, brought back into a geographical proximity here in Middle-earth. He wanted that, and Fingon doesn't know, and it doesn't matter because he's doing it anyway. He's doing it out of principle. And that's always admirable, right? It's just always admirable. So something happens here. He goes under the cover of darkness, right? Evil is self-defeating. We'll just have that tick. Evil is self-defeating. That's the thing that's always true in Tolkien's work. Morgoth has chosen to shroud Thangorodrim and the mountains, the land above Angband, in darkness, which allows Fingon to sneak in, to climb the shoulder of Thangorodrim, and to look down at the desolation of the land, but he cannot find a way down to Angband. He can't find a way to get in. For all he knows, Maedhros is inside Morgoth's fortress. Let's kind of emphasize the magnitude of the undertaking which Fingon has taken here, right? So what does he do? In this moment of hopelessness, in this moment of despair, in defiance of the orcs who cowered still in the dark vaults beneath the earth, he takes his harp and sings a song of Valinor that the Noldor made of old before strife was born among the sons of Finwë, and his voice rang in the mournful hollows that had never heard before aught save cries of fear and woe. And this is familiar. to us. This is familiar to us coming from The Lord of the Rings in particular, because this is a moment of typology, right? This is a familiar structure. We've seen someone do basically exactly this before, and though it plays out slightly differently, there's enough commonality between these two moments. Well, there's enough commonality. I have entitled this slide, what am I going to do? Not quote Sam's song? I'm absolutely going to quote Sam's song from Book 6, Chapter 1, The Tower of Cirith Ungol. This is after Frodo has been taken. Sam is searching for him, and he has lost hope. Quote, he murmured old childish tunes out of the Shire and snatches of Mr. Bilbo's rhymes that came into his mind like fleeting glimpses of the country of his home. And then suddenly new strength rose in him, and his voice rang out, while words of his own came unbidden to fit the simple tune. In western lands beneath the sun, the flowers may rise in spring. The trees may bud, the waters run, the merry finches sing. Or there may be 'tis cloudless night, and swaying beaches bear the elven stars as jewels white amid their branching hair. Though here at journey's end I lie, in darkness buried deep, beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep. Above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell. This is Sam responding to this moment of desperation, this moment of despair, this moment of need, this moment of fellow feeling, right? He too has lost his friend and sees no way forward. And in the immediate aftermath of this, he ostensibly hears the echoes of another voice joining in at the end of his song. It turns out to not be another voice. It turns out to be the footsteps of the orc Snaga. But Snaga does lead Sam immediately to Frodo. There is something like eucatastrophe. There is something like beauty. There is something like secondary creation. And we'll see here also, too, Sam's understanding suddenly that they are in the same story that indeed Fingon has been in too. But there are commonalities between these two moments, right? Obviously, the appeal to the West. In Western lands beneath the sun. Well, the sun is very new for Fingon, but yes, in Western lands beneath the sun, the flowers may rise in spring, the trees may bud, the waters run, the merry finches sing. All of this is very familiar, right? Sam is obviously singing of the country of his home, as it says here, but he's singing of the Shire, but he's singing of the West. He's singing of those places of gentility, of civility, of beauty, those places, well, I was going to say unmarred, which is, of course, too loaded to be accurate, but those places which are least marred, perhaps, that are most perfect in all of Arda. But the elven stars as jewels white amid their branching hair, right? Echoing out to Varda, echoing out to the starlit skies above Cuivanen, echoing out ultimately to Eärendil, too. If you know the rest of the Silmarillion, you're kind of maybe making that reference as well. But like Fingon here, we're seeing Sam reflect for a moment on where he is. Though here at journey's end I lie, in darkness buried deep. Just like Fingon, right? Beneath the darkness of the smoke of Thangorodrim, he is here stranded, right? This is the hopeless end of his journey. Beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep. Difficult not to think of Thangorodrim in that moment. Above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell. There is always hope. There is always grace. There is always a light beyond the darkness. That is a fundamental, inarguable, inalienable point of Tolkien's cosmology, yes, but of Tolkien's philosophy too, his theology. He understands that behind it all there is the light. And that is what Sam is remembering. That is what Fingon is remembering. And we see the manifestation of that. We take a moment to act as channels for that white light, right? It's not a coincidence that in this moment, Fingon is singing a song of his creation, of their creation, right? And Sam is singing spontaneously a song of his creation in this moment, both of which kind of echo this mythopoetic idea that as creative people, we are reflecting the light of God, right? We're kind of channeling that light into new art, but the art is the light itself. It is the light of God. It is that creative push. So we see here echo. We see here typography for sure, right? This typographical comparison between the two. Though I will say, as much as I love, God, I mean, who doesn't love Sam being poetical, right? We love a poetical Sam here in this house. In this house, we love a poetical Sam. But what I really adore here is what happens for Fingon. It's so much more powerful because we get a moment of genuine connection, right? What Sam thinks he hears, another voice raised in song with his own. Well, that's what Fingon actually experiences. Let's move on to the next slide. Thus, Fingon found what he sought. For suddenly, far above him, For suddenly above him, far and faint, his song was taken up, and a voice answering called to him. Maedhros it was that sang amid his torment, but Fingon climbed to the foot of the precipice where his kinsman hung, and then could go no further, and he wept when he saw the cruel device of Morgoth. Maedhros, therefore, being in anguish, without hope, begged Fingon to shoot him with his bow. And Fingon strung an arrow and bent his bow, and seeing no better hope, he cried to Manwë, saying, O king, to whom all birds are dear, speed now this feathered shaft, and recall some pity for the Noldor in their need. His prayer was answered swiftly. For Manwë, to whom all birds are dear, and to whom they bring news upon Taniquetil from Middle-earth, had sent forth the race of eagles, commanding them to dwell in the crags of the north, and to keep watch upon Morgoth. For Manwë still had pity for the exiled elves. And the eagles brought news of much that passed in those days to the sad ears of Manwë. Now, even as Fingon bent his bow, there flew down from the high airs Thorondor, king of eagles, mightiest of all birds that have ever been, whose outstretched wings spanned 30 fathoms. And staying Fingon's hand, he took him up and bore him to the face of the rock where Maedhros hung. But Fingon could not release the hell-wrought bond upon his wrist, nor sever it, nor draw it from the stone. Again, therefore, in his pain, Maedhros begged that he would slay him. But Fingon cut off his hand above the wrist, and Thorondor bore them back to Mithrim. So, we find this moment of eucatastrophe, absolutely a moment of eucatastrophe, right? We have Fingon acting in this moment as a sub-creator, acting in this moment as an artist, creating this song, right? Even if he didn't necessarily write every facet of the song as he progresses, he still calls forth the music now and plays it despite the orcs that are cowering beneath the surface of the earth. He plays the song, and Maedhros responds. Suddenly far above him and faint, the song was taken up, and a voice answering called to him. Maedhros it was that sang amid his torment, right? This moment of connection between the two. But it's not that simple, because Fingon can't get to him. He can't rescue him. So Maedhros begs Fingon to shoot him. And then we get a prayer, an actual prayer, right? A cry to Manwë, O king, to whom all birds are dear, speed now this feathered shaft. Let's be clear on this too, right? The reason that he is calling to Manwë is not necessarily for external intervention. He is not hoping that the eagles will come. The eagles will come. Instead, he is asking for the blessing on the feathered shaft of his arrow. He's asking Manwë to speed this arrow into the breast of his friend and thus kill him and end his torment, right? Because the arrow is fletched with the feathers of birds. O king, to whom all birds are dear, speed now this feathered shaft and recall some pity for the Noldor in their need. And then we have to be careful. Right? Then we have to be a little wise, a little studious, I suppose, because it's important, I think, to pay attention to what is actually happening, to what it actually says on the page, rather than reading what is presented in a tempting fashion for us to read, right? That in his moment of desperation, Fingon prays to Manwë, and Manwë intervenes, and lo, Manwë sends the eagle to aid Fingon, which is kind of what happens, but not literally. For Manwë, to whom all birds are dear, and to whom they bring news upon Taniquetil from Middle-earth, had sent forth the race of eagles, right? Had already, in the past, had sent forth the race of eagles, commanding them to dwell in the crags of the north, to keep watch upon Morgoth, for Manwë still had pity for the exiled elves. So, firstly, this had already happened. The eagles are already here. They are keeping watch on Morgoth. Why? Not because of Fingon's prayer, not because of this moment of desperation, as well-intentioned and as true as it might be, but because Manwë still has pity for the exiled elves. He sent the eagles out just to keep an eye on them, just to make sure that if there are good things that can happen, the eagles assist those good things. The eagles brought news of much that passed in those days to the sad ears of Manwë, right? Not this specifically, but just in general, sad things are happening, right? He saw what happened, or not saw, heard about what happened to Fëanor, heard about what happened to Fingolfin, backing down from the gates of Angband and going back to rebuild his strength. Now, even as Fingon bent his bow, there flew down from the high airs Thorondor, king of eagles. Is this Manwë's direct intervention? Is this Manwë magicking an eagle to go and help Fingon? No. He's just there already. Thorondor is already there at the the command, the benevolent command of Manwë, right? He has sent the eagles expressly to do exactly this. This isn't the answering of a prayer in the conventional, particularly, Christian sense. This is something that is much more fundamental, right? This is goodness. This is the goodness of Manwë, the pity of Manwë for the exiled elves. And we know how important pity is, right? This is the pity of Manwë opening the door to the possibility of eucatastrophe, to the possibility of intervention, to the possibility of the eagles coming. Which, of course, we're going to echo again and again, right? This is not the first. This is not... Oh boy. Okay. Chronologically in the history of Arda, this is the first time that the eagles have come. This will not chronologically be the last time that the eagles come. If we are reading from The Hobbit, of course, this is, the third great intervention of the eagles, and many more besides. 4 if you count Gandalf being rescued from Orthanc. I'm just saying the eagles come. It's a thing that they do. But Fingon could not release the hell-wrought bond upon his wrist, nor sever it, nor draw it from the stone. Again, therefore, in pain, Maedhros begged that he would slay him. But Fingon cut off his hand above the wrist, and Thorondor bore them, good Lord, back to Mithrim. And we have to, I think, also consider the plea from Maedhros, because we have not... with any real intention. Obviously, I'm thinking of Midiel Sindere here, right? Which is a slightly different set of circumstances. But we haven't wrestled with the idea of suicide for an elf. What does that even mean? What does it mean for a regular elf to consider the possibility of ending their own lives? And I guess this is less suicide than it is, the removal of pain. It is the ending of pain here. We don't know what it is for a regular elf to consider this, knowing that the Fea of elves goes to the halls of Mandos, and that they may, in fact, at some point re-inhabit a body very similar to their own, right? What does the death of the corporeal form mean to an average elf? What does it mean to one of the Noldor? What does it mean to one of the Noldor laboring under the doom of the Noldor? What does it mean if you know that if you die, you are going to the halls of Mandos forever and you will not be returned to physical form? It's difficult to talk about. We don't really have enough to speculate, but we can still, in that moment, I think, be powerfully moved by Maedhros' plight. The thing that this manages to communicate is his desperation. The thing that this manages to communicate is the terror and the wrath and the ruin of Morgoth, his ruthlessness here, just pinning him to the rock, binding him to the rock with an unbreakable bond, such that Fingon is forced to take a path that is, imperfect in its resolution to the circumstance, right? He doesn't save the day. He does what is necessary to free his friend. It's a much more, again, kind of a typological event here, right? Kind of a phenomenon that we're going to see again. This loss of, let's not say loss. Let's say the suffering of a wound, right? In order to escape is a thing that we will see again and again, moving through, in particular, The Lord of the Rings. But we are not done. Maedhros is freed here at the cost of his hand, and Thorondor bears them back to Mithrim. And I'm almost out of time, but I think we can do a few more slides. Let's stick around. Let's do a few more. I want to at least get to Thingol, right? We should definitely get to Thingol before we wrap up for this evening. There, Maedhros in time was healed, for the fire of life was hot within him, and his strength was of the ancient world, such as those possessed who were nurtured in Valinor. His body recovered from his torment and became hale, but the shadow of his pain was in his heart, and he lived to wield his sword with left hand more deadly than his right had been. By this deed Fingon won great renown, for all the Noldor praised him, and the hatred between the houses of Fingolfin and Fëanor was assuaged. For Maedhros begged forgiveness from the desertion in Ahriman, and he waived his claim to kinship over all the Noldor, saying to Fingolfin, "If there lay no grievance between us, Lord, still the kingship would rightly come to you, the eldest here of the house of Finwë, and not the least wise." But to this his brothers did not all in their hearts agree. Therefore, even as Mandos foretold, the house of Fëanor was called the Dispossessed, because the overlordship passed from it, the elder, to the house of Fingolfin, both in Elendë and in Beleriand, and because also of the loss of the Silmarils. But the Noldor, being again united, set a watch upon the borders of Dor Daedaloth, and Angband was beleaguered from west and south and east, and they sent forth messengers far and wide to explore the countries of Beleriand, and to treat with the people that dwelt there. So let's look first at Maedhros. He heals, for the fire of life was hot within him, and his strength was of the ancient world, such as those possessed who were nurtured in Valinor, right? He's still a hell of a guy. He's still empowered by the light of Aman. He still is of the Calaquendi. He saw the trees in Valinor. He witnessed their light, and now he is still powerful enough to heal this, but not completely. The shadow of his pain was in his heart. And I think that we can read this here. And he lived to wield his sword with left hand more deadly than his right had been. What is the virtue of deadliness? What is the virtue of strength of arms, of skill at arms. We're acknowledging here the wound that he has suffered, right? His body becomes hale, but presumably he does not regrow his hand, right? He doesn't become whole again in the way that we might expect, magical healing to accomplish. He learns to wield his sword and becomes more deadly and feels still the shadow of the pain within his heart, right? Well, of course, Frodo is the example, though by no means the only example, of being wounded with this great malevolence, with the darkness of the foe, the darkness of the enemy, right? And bearing that wound even after your physical form has healed. That's the story of Frodo at the end of The Lord of the Rings. So here we see something similar happening to Maedhros, but he has learned through this experience, through this crucible, he's learned a kind of wisdom. It's incomplete, right? Maedhros is not done being Maedhros. He is not done being a son of Fëanor, and his oath is still very much upon him. His doom, too, still very much upon him. But in this moment, he has changed a little, right? Fingon has managed to achieve his goal of reunifying the different houses of the Noldor at this point. By this deed, Fingon won great renown, and all the Noldor praised him, and the hatred between the houses of Fingolfin and Fëanor was assuaged. 4. Maedhros begged forgiveness for the desertion in Ahriman. He's apologizing for leaving the rest of the host behind, taking the boats and then burning the boats, right? Not his father's action, of course. And he waived his claim to kingship over all the Noldor. This one's a little harder. This one's a little trickier, I think, to really wrap your head around because, well, on the one hand, right, he says to Fingolfin, if there lay no grievance between us, Lord, still the kingship would rightly come to you, the eldest here of the house of Finwë, and not the least wise, right? You are the oldest that remains, and after the death of Fëanor, right, Fingolfin, the brother, would inherit, except that if that were just true, then Maedhros would not have to say it. And if that were just true, if Elven society were structured like this, and Fingolfin was naturally going to inherit, then the line of Fëanor, the house of Fëanor, would not need to become the dispossessed, right? To be dispossessed indicates that you have lost something, which means that presumably the crown, the throne, whatever kind of metonymic image we're using here to describe the rulership of the Noldor, would have passed to Maedhros under normal circumstances, right? So he says, if there lay no grievance between us, Lord, still the kingship would rightly come to you, the eldest here of the house of Finwë, not the least wise. But clearly that is not true, which means that this is a huge gesture. And we can tell that this is not true, too, right? To this his brothers did not all in their hearts agree. We're going to see further friction and enmity arise from this choice of Maedhros. But what he does in this moment is still incredibly significant, because what he does in this moment is to unify the different branches of the Noldor, and in that unification, they are able to beleaguer Angband, right? This is the siege of Angband. West, south, and east. Then they sent forth messengers far and wide to explore the countries of Beleriand and to treat with the people that dwelt there. They are now holding the line. They are now watching Morgoth. They are beleaguering him, right? Beleaguering and holding the siege are the same thing here. I think it's fascinating to look here also at... This is a little trickier, right? This is one of these rabbit holes that I really want to go down, but A, it's going to take a little while, and B, I'm not sure there's anything at the end of it. I'm not sure there's like a conclusion that we can meaningfully come to. But one of the most provocative turns of phrase here, I think, relates to Fingolfin's role as king. Therefore, even as Maedhros foretold, the house of Fëanor were called the dispossessed, because the overlordship passed from it, the elder, to the house of Fingolfin, both in Elendë and in Beleriand. Well, I have no trouble with Fingolfin being king here in Beleriand, right? But he's also king in Elendë, in Eldamar, right? The elf-inhabited parts of Aman. He is the king in Tirion-upon-Tuna, which is wild, because Finarfin, as far as we know, is ruling in Tirion-upon-Tuna. And Finarfin is not part of the house of Fingolfin. They both spring from Finwë, yes, but there is a concept of high kingship here, right? There is a kind of overlordship that is happening here that I find really interesting and a little baffling. I find... We talked about this back in the Q&A. Travis had an excellent question in this week's Q&A about this kind of political preconception, this kind of political ideology that comes into Tolkien's work from his understanding of the medieval period and this kind of post-Norman conquest idea of agnatic primogeniture, right? Of the eldest son inheriting. And that feeling fundamental, that feeling natural, that feeling like the way the world ought to work. And when you just assume anything about how the world should work, that's when it becomes ideological. That's when you stop questioning it. That's when it becomes a part of your character and perspective in a way that you are not actively analyzing. And that seems to have happened here too. I'm not sure functionally, politically, what we get, because there's no actual like political use or meaning to Fingolfin being king in Elendë here. There's no sense that they're going to return. There's no sense that they're ever going to see the shores of Valinor again. What does it mean for Maedhros to give up this throne to Fingolfin? That's as far as we can go without, as I say, spending a lot of time chewing over this and getting not much out of it. Meanwhile, Thingol. Let's get to Thingol. Now, King Thingol welcomed not with a full heart the coming of so many princes in might out of the west, eager for new realms. And he would not open his kingdom, nor remove its girdle of enchantment, for wise with the wisdom of Melian, he trusted not that the restraint of Morgoth would endure. Alone of the princes of the Noldor, those of Finarfin's house were suffered to pass within the confines of Doriath, for they could claim close kinship, with King Thingol himself, since their mother was Eärwen of Alqualondë, Olwë's daughter. Angrod, son of Finarfin, was the first of all the exiles to come to Menegroth as messenger of his brother Finrod, and he spoke long with the king, telling him of the deeds of the Noldor in the north, and of their numbers, and of the ordering of their force. But being true and wise-hearted, and thinking all griefs now forgiven, he spoke no word concerning the kinslaying, nor of the manner of the exile of the Noldor and the oath of Fëanor. King Thingol hearkened to the words of Angrod, and ere he went, he said to him, "Thus shall you speak for me to those who have sent you. In Hithlum the Noldor have leave to dwell, and in the highlands of Dorthonion, and in the lands east of Doriath that are empty and wild, but elsewhere there are many of my people, and I would not have them restrained of their freedom, still less ousted from their homes. Beware, therefore, how you princes of the west bear yourselves, for I am the Lord of Beleriand, and all who seek to dwell there shall hear my word. Into Doriath none shall come to abide, but only such as I call as guests, or who seek me in great need." Thingol drawing the line here. So yes, of course, Olwë of Alqualondë was, of course, the younger brother of Elwë, who changed his name to become Thingol. So the people of Alqualondë, the Teleri of Alqualondë, are kin to the Sindarin here in Beleriand, to the people of Doriath in Beleriand. Finarfin is married to, as it says here, Eärwen of Alqualondë, and that is why those sons are part Teleri and thus related to Thingol by blood. They're the only branch of that family that is related through their mother Eärwen, the Swan Maiden of Alqualondë, to the house of Thingol. So clearly the thing that we have two things to look at here, right? We have to look at King Thingol's kind of rule of Doriath, right? His authority here. He welcomed not with a full heart the coming of so many princes in might out of the west, eager for new realms, which you can understand, right? All at once, these elves who are maybe not the equal of Thingol alone in stature, but are definitely better than all the local guys, right? Like, they are definitely elves plus. Like, his guys, like, level 5 elves, maybe level 6 on a good day. These guys are coming in with, like, level 12 epic feats. They are coming in with, like, better gear, more skills, more spells. They are ready to throw down, and Thingol cannot compete with that. So he welcomes them, yes, but as we're going to learn in the next slide, really does send them to the crappier parts of Beleriand. He really says, like, yeah, you can go live in the wilderness. You can go be a buffer between me and Morgoth. That's absolutely fine. But for all that, it is courteous enough, decent enough. It is honest enough, for sure. But it's all of those things because of, well, Angrod's choice, right? And I'm so interested here. This is just like us being told that Fingolfin does not rescue Maedhros because he doesn't hear him, or being told that Thingol goes forth not because he believes that Maedhros is alive or cares about him at all, but because he feels that sting of friendship, right? We're being told very clearly the motivation here so that we can feel some of that dramatic irony, so that we can feel some of that emotional torque and some of the tragedy of what is about to unfold. So Angrod, because he is true and wise-hearted and thinking all griefs now forgiven, he speaks no word concerning the kinslaying, nor the manner of the exile of the Noldor, or the oath of Fëanor. not because he is being duplicitous. Let's be very clear on that. He is not trying to mislead Thingol at all. He is not trying to present himself and his kin now, including all of the Noldor of Beleriand. He's not trying to present himself or his kin as being better than they are. He's not trying to hide anything. Because he is true and wise-hearted, he has forgiven and thus forgotten. And this is going to be calamitous. This is going to be absolutely tragic. This is going to be like just the worst thing that could possibly happen. It's going to have disastrous consequences. But does that mean that Angrod is right to keep quiet out of this truthfulness, out of this wise-heartedness, out of this sense of resolution, out of this sense of forgiveness even, right? What do we think? Do we think that we can credit to Angrod wisdom? Is he as wise in his wisdom as Thingol is in the wisdom of Melian? It's tough to say. Certainly there are going to be consequences. It is now past the time that I really have to stop. But you know what I think we can do? Let's do 3 more slides, and that will get us to the point at which I think I mentioned this back at the beginning of tonight's session, that at that point, the temporal schematic of these chapters really accelerates. We start racing through like 250 years in the last, I don't know, couple of pages, last 4 or 5 pages of this chapter. So we'll hold that for next week, and we'll do the geography of Beleriand. I'll talk a little more about our plans for next week in just a moment. 3 more slides in which great things will occur and Caranthir will be the worst. Beginning now, in fact. Now the lords of the Noldor held council in Mithrim, and thither came Angrod out of Doriath, bearing the message of King Thindel. Cold it seemed its welcome to the Noldor, and the sons of Fëanor were angered at the words, but Maedhros laughed, saying, "A king is he that can hold his own, or else his title is vain. Thingol does but grant us lands where his power does not run. Indeed, Doriath alone would be his realm this day, but for the coming of the Noldor. Therefore in Doriath let him reign, and be glad that he has the sons of Finwë for his neighbours, not the orcs of Morgoth that we found. Elsewhere it shall go good as it seems to us." But Caranthir, who loved not the sons of Finarfin, who was the harshest of the brothers and most quick to anger, cried aloud, "Yea, more! Let not the sons of Finarfin run hither and thither with their tales to this dark elf in his caves. Who made them our spokesman to deal with him? And though they are come indeed to Beleriand, let them not so swiftly forget that their father is a lord of the Noldor, though their mother be of other kin." Then Angrod was wrathful and went forth from the council. Maedhros indeed rebuked Caranthir, but the greater part of the Noldor of both followings, hearing his words, were troubled in heart, fearing the fell spirit of the sons of Fëanor that it seemed would ever be like to burst forth in rash word or violence. But Maedhros restrained his brothers, and they departed from the council, and soon afterwards they left Mithrim and went eastward beyond Aros to the wide hills around the hill of Himning. That region was named thereafter the March of Maedhros, for northwards there was little defence of hill or river against assault from Angband. There Maedhros and his brothers kept watch, gathering all such people as would come to them, and they had few dealings with their kinfolk westward, save at need. It is said indeed that Maedhros himself devised this plan to lessen the chances of strife, and because he was very willing that the chief peril of assault should fall upon himself. And he remained for his part in friendship with the houses of Fingolfin and Finarfin, and would come among them at times for common counsel. Yet he also was bound by his oath, though it slept now for a time. So Maedhros here, practicing a kind of good counsel. Okay, well, Thingol doesn't want us to come and live in Doriath. He wants us to go to places where, we're a buffer between him and the orcs, and that's fine. Because if we hadn't come along, he would only have Doriath anyway, and he would have orcs for neighbors, rather than these well-intentioned Noldori that I see around me now. But Caranthir is not having it, who loved not the sons of Finarfin and was the harshest of the brothers and the most quick to anger, cried aloud, "Yea, more! Let not the sons of Finarfin run hither and thither with their tales to this dark elf in his caves." He's fearing treachery. This is the doom of the Noldor, treachery and the fear of treachery. This is what will constantly poison the hearts of the Noldor who languish under the doom imposed upon them by Mandos. So Angrod is wrathful and goes forth from the council. Right, we can understand him feeling a little upset at this point. Though they become indeed to Beleriand, let them not so swiftly forget that their father is a lord of the Noldor, though their mother be of other kin. Caranthir just really inventing racism here. Just like first principles, inventing division and rancor according to who you are, right? We have seen distinction and diversity before, but I'm not sure, even when the dwarves came, the elves may look upon them as cumbrous and unlovely. That's not entirely fair. They looked upon their language as being cumbrous and unlovely, but they did look upon the orcs as being stunted, right? There's something there. There's a friction between the two. They're not always going to be easily companionable, but now Caranthir is drawing lines. Caranthir the Dark is really like pushing back against the Teleri presence here among the Noldor, the flawed blood of this one line of the House of Finwë, which is, of course, right, indicative of terrible things to come. And what's so fantastic here is that everyone knows that it's indicative of terrible things to come. The greater part of the Noldor of both followings, hearing his words were troubled in heart, fearing the fell spirit of the sons of Fëanor, that it seemed would ever be like to burst forth in rash word of, god damn. We've come through all of this. We've reunited the Noldori. We have beleaguered Angband. We are ready now. We are settling and we've made contact with Thingol. Did you know he has a whole kingdom to the south? How cool is that? We're reunited with our kin here in Beleriand. And this is unstable because the sons of Fëanor are always going to find some way to ruin that. They are always going to spark to violence of word or deed at some point. And Maedhros understands that too, right? He rebukes Caranthir. He restrains his brothers. They depart from the council. And then they go eastward. They leave this dwelling place of the Noldor and go and form a new community right in the firing line of Angband, right? This is the March of Maedhros. March here is used geographically to mean a border or a frontier, right? It is a place between two countries, or a occupying space between two countries, or on the fringes of one country without like a serious geographical protection. There's no delineating line here. The marches of Maedhros are just open to the north to Angband. And it's a strong choice to put himself in harm's way. And we might speculate a great deal. If you guys have thoughts on why it is that Maedhros is willing to face this chief peril of assault, right? He wants the chief peril of assault to fall upon himself, even though he personally, he cannot trust at this point his immediate brothers, his immediate kin, but he is still friends with Fingolfin and Finarfin. He can still, or with the people of Fingolfin and Finarfin, he can still go west and take counsel with them even, right? The thing that his father could never do, none changed his mind by force and seldom by counsel, as we're told of Fëanor. Maedhros is taking counsel. Maedhros is doing the good thing. He's trying his best. Maedhros is becoming increasingly someone who is laboring under the doom of his blood, right? He is laboring under the consequence of the choices that he has made earlier in his life. So they go east, they establish this new line of defense, the March of Maedhros, and maybe things are going to be just fine, but Caranthir, of course, isn't satisfied. Now the people of Caranthir dwelt furthest east, beyond the upper waters of Gallion, about Lake Helavorn, under Mount Rerir to the southward, and they climbed the heights of Ered Luin and looked eastward in wonder, for wild and wide it seemed to them were the lands of Middle-earth. And thus it was that Caranthir's people came upon the dwarves, who after the onslaught of Morgoth and the coming of the Noldor had ceased their traffic into Beleriand. But though either people loved skill and were eager to learn, no great love was there between them, for the dwarves were secret and quick to resentment, and Caranthir was haughty, and scarce concealed his scorn for the unloveliness of the Naugrim, and his people followed their lord. Nevertheless, since both peoples feared and hated Morgoth, they made alliance, and had of it great profit. For the Naugrim learned many secrets of craft in those days, so that the smiths and masons of Nogrod and Belagost became renowned among their kin. And when the dwarves began again to journey into Beleriand, all of the traffic of the dwarf mines passed first through the hands of Caranthir, and thus great riches came to him. So Caranthir, already just like provably, demonstrably the worst here, both takes his racism to an entirely new level and invents capitalism, I guess, invents exploitative economic capitalism here. And they say that Tolkien has nothing to say to the modern reader, right? They say that Tolkien has nothing to say of the world of 2025. Well, let me tell you, Caranthir is what we call an object lesson. So this basically, right, this is basically the point at which the timescale accelerates, right? Now that we've settled this new status quo, we're going to jump ahead between here and the next slide that we will cover at the beginning of next week's session. We're going to jump ahead 30 years, and we're going to jump ahead another 30 years, and we're going to jump ahead 100, and then another 100. And these are years of the sun, so it's a much more manageable kind of time frame, but we're still picking up the pace as we accelerate toward the end of this chapter, and continually, as I say, kind of, I mentioned last week that we're much closer to the ground now, right? One of the reasons that this chapter has taken so much time to cover, one of the reasons that we're so in the weeds now with it, is that it's simply a story, right? We have moved from this kind of historical, well, I guess originally mythic kind of rhetorical tier down to a historical rhetorical tier, and now we're just telling a fantasy story. We're going to stop doing that in a moment, and we're going to start telling history again. We're going to start pulling the camera out a little bit, but we've got more characters in tonight's reading than we've had in maybe the whole book to this point combined. Like in terms of developed characters, developed psychologies, real bonds of like friendship and human emotion, relatable emotion that we ourselves as readers can recognize. We're doing more of that now than we've done before. It's part of that drawing closer to the ground that I described a little last week, which makes these jumps ahead in time and certainly makes the pivot into the next chapter all the more disconcerting. It's a strange thing to face the geography of Beleriand at this point. I was struck by it mostly because I had spent so much time last week thinking about the creation of the sun and the moon, thinking about that chapter and thinking about the ways in which it is different, the ways in which it feels out of place within that part of the Silmarillion in particular. We're still there. We're going to do it again. And this one's a little less explicable. I don't really know what to make of it. It is full. Here's the thing. If you're looking ahead at of Beleriand and its realms with a certain fear, a certain discomfort, I completely understand it. I completely recognize it. It is full of the most beautiful language. If you're a fan of Tolkien's constructed languages, if you're a fan of his made up words, we're gonna eat out next week. We're gonna dine next week. It is going to be so fantastic to get to in its breadth and all the realms of Beleriand. In fact, okay, that is going to do it. I really do need to wrap up now. Thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. Let me show you this slide that I have that is here completely inadequate to the task presented here. Next week, crucially, Wednesday night. My schedule compels me to a rare Wednesday evening recording. We are going to cover, the end of 13, all of 14, and chapter 15 of the Silmarillion. We'll do the best we can, you guys. We'll do the best we can. And chapter 15 there, that's of the Noldor in Beleriand. That will hopefully get us back on track. Maybe I'll just try and set a little extra time aside. We'll take an extra length show. Then the following week, April 10th, that I think is back on the Thursday, we're going to cover chapter 16 of Maeglin, who sucks. That's editorial. Forgive me. The chapter is just called Of Maeglin. That's not Tolkien's original intent. But if you think of that chapter, Of Maeglin, who sucks, I think that's absolutely appropriate. And then chapter 17 of the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. After that, we're going to have another 8 sessions to round out this series, which means we're still on track to finish in the middle of June, which impossibly is exactly what I originally planned. So that's fantastic. At that point, we are going to switch gears here on Stars and Swords. And though I haven't formalized it yet, I have mentioned this over on the Discord, I think, and in the weekly live shows that I do every Monday night for Patreon supporters, a little show that I like to call Made It Through Monday, because you made it through Monday and so did I, so we deserve a show together. I've mentioned over there that I'm really thinking about doing some Jane Austen this summer. I'm thinking about the summer of Sense and Sensibility. That seems like a very pleasant way of spending the summer months. If you guys have other ideas, if you have other inclinations, if there's something else that you'd like me to discuss, please do get in touch. I'm more than happy to put up a poll. If everyone comes back and says, actually, Sense and Sensibility sounds great after the Silmarillion, then that would be fine. We can certainly look at that. That'll give us time to do something spooky in October, maybe something super short in November, and then we'll get, of course, to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, our third Narnia book, right around Christmas time. So many plans, so many books, so many things to see and do. That is going to do it for this week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for ratings and reviews. They help incalculably, which is weird, and I kind of feel bad for asking for them. But hey, if you like this show, go tell people that you like this show. Tell people in real life that you like this show. Tell people you actually know that you like this show. And then we can all come and hang out in the chat together during those live shows. If you would like the link to that live chat, head on over to patreon.com/nextword. You can follow that page for free, and you will get the link to each week's live session, so you can be here and join me in the chat. Join the wonderful Galadra Becky, who also, I see here, does not like fan fiction. Yeah, it's a controversial position, Becky, but, we're on the right side of history as far as this goes. And the wonderful Glorfin David, who is also here with us this week. And, of course, if you are feeling so inclined, you can also head over to patreon.com/nextword and help me financially. There's a reason that we do this without the tyranny of ads. There's a reason that you haven't heard Ryan Reynolds shilling cheap cell phone service on this podcast, and to quote Hoobastank, the reason, my friends, is you. Is that Hoobastank? Who can say? Nobody knows. Science has yet to determine anything at all about, popular music of the early 2000s. I've clearly been podcasting for far too long. It's time for me to say goodnight. Thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you all have a wonderful week. I will see you next Wednesday night for got just a good old chunk of the Silmarillion. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this week's show. I'll talk to you all again soon. Until then.